Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of 3 for Chapter 5, Resource Development in Canada. So the second question that we're going to answer is, how do we decide whether to develop a natural resource? We started looking into that when we answered the first question. Now we'll look at that in more detail. So consumers, you, the person who's buying the product, their desire for goods and services create demand. And obviously this is a money-making venture. And so if there's demand, then the demand has to be met through resource development and industry. If there's no demand, there's no point in doing it. Corporations or companies play a role. They provide the skills and technology. They're the ones who are doing the extracting and the manufacturing and refining. And so their capacity, how well they're able to provide the machinery and technology and people, that plays a role, of course. Other stakeholders. Stakeholders means people who have a say and are part of the whole process and have an interest in what's going on. In universities and colleges, perhaps they're providing the programs that people need to take in order to be able to work in these industries, doing co-op programs as well, or just doing research. Non-governmental organizations, that would be like environmental organizations that are not part of the government, but they also would have an interest in whether, for example, a mining company, whether they leave the land the way that they found it as much as possible and what kind of impact they're having on the environment. Those types of ideas, those groups have an interest in and have a role to play in decision making. The most important decision makers are the owners of the resources. In Canada, most are owned and controlled by governments. So we're going to take a second to think about the fact that Aboriginals have claims to land and resources. And when Canada was a brand new country, some First Nations groups signed treaties with Canada's government, giving up their ownership of land in exchange for specific rights. You may have talked about this in a history class. There's lots of controversy and disagreements as to what happened and why that happened that way. And we're still facing a lot of the consequences of this now. But the fact is that there were treaties that were signed that gave up lands. So the treaties applied to land in Ontario, prairies, Northwest Territories, but no treaties were signed for a lot of other places in Canada. And so if a company wants to develop a resource, this is a group of people that they need to be in communication with. So since they haven't signed treaties to give up their land in these regions, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in these areas argue that they have a right to make decisions about natural resource developments and to actually benefit from any developments that are allowed to go ahead. So lots of conversations need to happen. It's important to have them part of this process. So in general, using natural resources promotes economic development, generates wealth. It in general is a good thing to use the resources given. But of course, throughout this unit, we have to consider whether it's sustainable use or not. Governments cooperate with companies to give them access to resources without giving them ownership of the land. And so there's an agreement that has to go on. They don't own the land, but companies get rights to develop what's there. So challenges of managing natural resources. Managers must also make sure that extraction and reclamation, that means, again, making sure the land is left as close to what it was in the beginning as possible, that you're not impacting the land negatively long-term. It also needs to meet the needs of local residents. So the people in the area have a right to maintain their living standard and not be affected by what's going on negatively. It has to follow accepted standards of environmental responsibility. So there's lots of rules associated with that and are reported on publicly. So it's accountability. It's making sure that the companies aren't doing things that are against the law or that are hurting people. Additional issues arise when trying to manage shared resources. So what that means is, what if you have two groups of people, two countries even, that are sharing a resource, and maybe those countries have different rules? How do you make sure that that resource is managed properly? What if they don't agree on what the rules even are? So that becomes difficult. An example of this is the Great Lakes, actually, and this is a backyard example, so to speak, because we are involved here. We are sharing the Great Lakes with lots of other places. And so there is a committee. It's called the International Joint Commission, and IJCs for short. And they work to prevent disputes or disagreements between Canada and the United States over quality and use of transboundary water bodies. That means water bodies that that go over boundaries or borders is the word I'm looking for. So that includes the Great Lakes, but also Red River, which you may not have heard of. I hadn't really heard of it. So the Great Lakes Basin, the basin just means all the water associated with the Great Lakes. So that includes rivers and streams flowing into it as well. And that whole area is home to 33 million people, including 9 million Canadians. So lots of people are affected by this area. Over the decades, the water quality in the Great Lakes watershed, again, watershed is similar to basin in that it's all the water in a certain area that comes together and eventually ends up in the Great Lakes. It has improved dramatically over the last few decades, largely through controls on industrial wastes and better sewage treatment plants encouraged by that commission. So ongoing issues, I mean, we've improved, but there's lots of improvement to be done. Water levels and invasive species, which you might have talked about in science class. So the IJC monitors many of the water bodies that are shared by Canada and the United States. The Commission conducts water quantity and quality studies to determine the state of the water bodies and posts its findings on its website. So it has public access. So the diagram is showing the river, for example, kind of all the way down here. And the blue is the Red River watershed boundary. Again, watershed just means the entire land area. All the water that falls in this whole region that's outlined in blue will eventually make it to the river, which eventually makes it to the Great Lakes. Okay, that concludes the second part of this series, and just one more left.